right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the SMB Franchise Advisors channel. Today, I'm very excited. We've got the COO of SMB with Ken Moran, very experienced in franchising. He's kind of done it all, worked at some major brands. He's been with Steve really throughout many, many years, kind of always been as a SMB. It's all about the relationship. So they've all been together for many years, learning the ins and outs of franchising. We're here today to talk about effective ways to kind of coach your incoming franchisees. You're a small business owner, or maybe you're already existing franchise owner with a few units, trying to get to that next level of growth. And really the only way to do that is, responsibly, effectively having those first 5 to 10 franchise owners be very happy and satisfied. So we're going to talk about some of those best practices today. So Ken, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Awesome. So Ken, I know, like I said, you have very vast experience, especially in the restaurant industry specifically. What would you say are some of those key elements of effective franchisee coaching? As some new franchise owner, they just signed that franchise application. What are kind of like those next steps in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I do have a pretty extensive background in terms of franchisee support. And so I think the first thing I would tell you, Josh, is that I've always approached a relationship with a new franchisee first from the standpoint of building the relationship. SMB certainly, we tout the fact that we are all about the relationship. I also think that from a franchisee support standpoint, if you don't develop a strong relationship, especially a relationship built on trust with the franchisee, it's difficult to really get the franchisee to respond to a lot of what it is that you're really going to be trying to get them to respond to in terms of their performance, making sure that they're meeting the standards, making sure that they're following the systems. So I've always really focused first on, building that relationship. Second, communication. I think communication is really a big key in a franchise support role, mainly because the franchisees are going to depend on you for a lot of different things, especially early in the process. So most franchisees don't necessarily know everything there is to know about operating the business, even though they may have been through your training. They may have obviously received your operations manual. It's really going to be the franchisee support person's job to sort of walk them through the first couple of months of that relationship. And so communication is key. And that communication really is both good and the bad. So there are going to be times when certainly you're patting them on the back and you're telling them what a terrific job they're doing. But there's also going to be time when you actually have to sort of call them out in terms of the standards, the systems, and really make sure that they understand the why as to what the standard is all about. So again, communication, I think, is the other thing. That sort of takes me into the third thing that I would tell you, and that is really making sure that you're providing a lot of direction and constructive feedback to the franchisees, even more so in the beginning of the relationship, because that is the time when most franchisees really are getting their feet wet. They're trying to understand everything that's coming at them at different times, and they're really trying to do the best job that they possibly can. So I think those are some of the things that I would tell you that I really think are key, especially in the early part of the relationship.
Okay, that's awesome, Ken. And I think that applies to like relationships or whatever it may be, between trust, communication, and having those clear directions in place for other people. I think that's super helpful. And let's say you're a franchise, you have all three of those things in place. Now you're kind of focused on like those day-to-day operations, kind of like the ins and outs of the business as kind of the franchise owner. Those early stages, as you mentioned, are very critical. So what are kind of like those best practices that you've developed through your experiences of kind of guiding those franchise owners to really understand the system in those, especially those first couple of days, weeks, months, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, I would tell you communication in a lot of different forms. So that can be formal or informal communication, but the communication really has to be pretty clear and concise. So some of what I've always tried to do is to make sure that I got into a cadence from a communication standpoint. So that might have been weekly emails, monthly face-to-face meeting, or even at this point now, as we move more towards technology, a Zoom meeting, some kind of face-to-face contact with the franchisee so that we can have a good give and take on what's going on in the business, what challenges they're facing, how I might be able to help them with those challenges. But it's really about working with the franchisee on a very regular basis from a communication standpoint, and being to help them analyze whatever issues and problems they may be seeing early on in the process. So
that's super helpful, Ken. And I'm sure a lot of these franchises, they probably have like what's called a franchise business coach, where there's actually people like boots on the ground helping some of these franchise owners, in addition to some of these kind of like weekly emails, monthly calls, whatever it may be. So I think all these things sound like very helpful in terms of communication, building the systems for those franchise owners to kind of get those boots off the ground. So let's talk about compliance and franchising. We're talking about the systems, the operations. How important is it for those new franchise owners to actually follow the magic word in franchising with systems and applying to those operations playbook?
Right. Everybody sees that word compliance as kind of a negative. There are ways to take that word and sort of turn it around. What I would tell you is obviously franchise compliance is key to making sure that there's consistency across the system. And so, my own approach to compliance, and the approach that I would always ask those people that work for me from a franchise support standpoint, is that compliance doesn't have to be about, us hitting franchisees over the head with a franchise agreement. Compliance can be about us trying to help them to get to the right place and the right result through some solid feedback. I think one of the keys in any system is making sure franchisees certainly are following the systems. Franchisees need to understand, first, what the standard is, but second, what the rationale behind some of these standards are. And I think that's kind of a key to franchise compliance. People need to understand that compliance revolves around making sure that there's consistency across the brand. And franchisees need to understand their role in making sure that you've that consistency across the brand. Without the consistency, you really don't have a brand. And so, it doesn't have to be about the negative in terms of the word compliance. It can be about making sure that you're communicating the rationale behind the things that you're asking them to do, what the standards are, what the systems are that they ought to be following, and then obviously calling them out to a degree, not necessarily in a negative, overly negative way, but calling them out when they're not necessarily following the system and really kind of doing everything they should be doing to protect the brand and the consistency that's needed.